On September 29, 2012, near the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, a chilling scream echoed through the cliffs, followed by a desperate call for help. At 5:45 p.m., a middle-aged man named Harold contacted the park's dispatch center, reporting that his wife, Toni, had fallen from a cliff and was in critical condition. By 6:30 p.m., with no rescue personnel having arrived yet, Harold, growing increasingly frantic, called 911 again. He explained that he had attempted CPR on his wife, but it seemed to have little effect, and she was barely breathing. His voice grew more urgent as he begged the operator to send a rescue helicopter. He mentioned that he had lit a small fire in hopes that the smoke would guide rescuers to their location. After some time, the dispatcher informed Harold that a park ranger was nearby and needed confirmation of their exact position. However, Harold had already lost signal. By 7:30 p.m., Harold sent a text message to Toni's brother, stating that he couldn't find her pulse. The Rocky Mountain National Park had fallen into darkness, and the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. A park ranger, carrying a backpack full of medical supplies, slowly made his way down the steep slope in the dark, finally reaching Harold after more than half an hour. There, at the base of the cliff, he found Harold performing chest compressions on his wife. The ranger told Harold to stop and began checking Toni's vital signs. By 10 p.m., Toni was declared dead. The tragic incident quickly made headlines in local newspapers. Reports described Toni as coming from a wealthy oil family, a devout Christian, a loving mother, a kind wife, and a skilled ophthalmologist. Like her husband, she had a passion for outdoor sports. But the question lingered: was this truly an accident? From the moment the ranger saw Harold with Toni, something felt off. The couple had seemingly done little to prepare for such a demanding hike. For starters, they had set out in the late afternoon on a round-trip hike through rugged, remote terrain, a challenging route for any hiker. Given that both Harold and Toni were in their 50s, this level of difficulty seemed overly risky. Additionally, the only light source they had was a small keychain flashlight, suggesting they hadn't planned to camp but rather expected to return before sunset, a near impossible task. What puzzled the ranger most was Harold's behavior when he arrived. Harold was frantically performing chest compressions on Toni, claiming he had been trying to resuscitate her for hours. But as a trained first responder, the ranger noticed something odd. Toni still wore lipstick. If Harold had truly been performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, her lipstick would have smudged, but it remained perfectly intact, and Harold's face was clean. Later that night, the ranger revisited the scene. Toni's body still lay on the branches and rocks, her hair disheveled and streaked with blood. Next to her was a purple backpack and a camera, curiously untouched. The camera contained numerous photos from their trip. In the images, Harold and Toni appeared close and affectionate, seemingly in love. But if their relationship was so strong, why didn't Harold seem more determined to save her? Could this tragic fall have been part of a more sinister plan orchestrated by Harold? On October 1, 2012, authorities paid a visit to Harold. He detailed the meticulously planned celebration for his 12th wedding anniversary. He explained how he had wanted a peaceful, romantic setting far from the crowds, which led him to take his wife, Toni, on a hike in the park. A few days earlier, Harold had surprised Toni by taking her to a hotel. On the day of the accident, they drove to the trailhead and began their hike at around 1:30 p.m. Originally, they intended to stop at the peak of the trail, but due to the large number of people there, they opted to head in a different direction to find a more intimate spot. By 3:30 p.m., they reached a rocky outcrop on the mountain, where they stopped for lunch, staying for about an hour. They planned to leave by 4:45 p.m. to ensure they would make it back in time for their anniversary dinner later that evening. However, things took an unexpected turn when Toni, using binoculars, spotted a fire lookout tower and a trail leading to it. They decided to walk a little further, arriving at a second rocky outcrop where they posed for photos. Shortly after, as Toni posed for a picture, Harold received a text from their babysitter, informing him that their daughter's soccer team had won a match. Excited, he looked up to share the news with his wife, only to witness Toni falling off the cliff. Panicking, Harold rushed to the edge, desperately searching for Toni. After a harrowing 45 minutes, he found her lying among the rocks. She was unconscious but still alive. Harold dragged her to a flat area and began performing CPR. During this process, Toni's head and shoulders brushed against the rocks, leaving bloodstains. Overcome with fear, Harold called for help. As he recounted the event to investigators, Harold spoke in a calm tone, showing no tears or signs of grief in his eyes. The investigators were stunned, pausing momentarily before asking if Toni had life insurance. Harold nodded, revealing there was a $1.5 million policy that would be placed in a trust fund for their daughter. Curious, the investigators searched Harold's Jeep and found a map in the glove compartment, marking various campgrounds and hiking routes in Rocky Mountain National Park. What caught their attention was a small pink X drawn on the map right at the spot where Toni had fallen. When questioned about it, Harold stumbled over his words, claiming he had no idea why the mark was there before hastily dismissing the investigators. Meanwhile, the coroner performed an autopsy on Toni. The report revealed that she had over a dozen fractures throughout her body, but her sternum was intact. This indirectly suggested that Harold had not performed CPR since chest compressions often fracture the sternum. Additionally, the pathologist noticed that Toni was still wearing her wedding ring, but the diamond, valued at $30,000, was missing. The evidence pointed to Toni either falling or being pushed from the cliff, sustaining multiple injuries that led to her death. While the manner of death remained uncertain, homicide could not be ruled out. So, what truly happened to Toni? What transpired between her and Harold? How could a couple that seemed so loving in the eyes of others end up in such a fatal situation? Toni was a highly intelligent ophthalmologist, successful in her career and financially well off. She had her own ophthalmology clinic but was often overwhelmed with work. Her previous marriage had ended in failure, causing her a great deal of stress. Despite this, she still longed for marriage and, even more so, for a child. This led her to turn to online dating websites, where she soon met Harold. In his profile, Harold presented himself as a deacon, geologist, and successful businessman. His interests included music, movies, and outdoor activities such as scuba diving, hiking, and camping. After dating for a few weeks, Harold met Toni's parents. Her father, a wealthy oil and gas businessman, was impressed by his future son-in-law. Harold seemed polite, humble, and genuine. During dinner, he briefly discussed his work as a geologist, but subtly emphasized his involvement in church activities and fundraising efforts, earning the family's approval. Although Harold had lost his first wife, Tony's family respected his privacy and never inquired about the cause of her death. They knew little about Harold, but they agreed to set the wedding date 9 months later. According to local tradition, the groom was responsible for paying for the wedding dinner, but Harold handed the bill to Tony's brother, promising to reimburse him later. The brother was puzzled. If Harold was as wealthy as he claimed, why didn't he cover the bill himself? Nevertheless, wanting to make his sister happy, he paid. Unsurprisingly, Harold never repaid him. On September 30th, 2000, Tony and Harold held a grand Southern wedding in Mississippi. Throughout the event, Harold demonstrated an unprecedented level of control, trying to dictate the entire pace of the wedding. After their marriage, the couple moved to Denver, where Harold claimed to have a thriving business. In 2002, Tony left her hometown for good and moved with Harold to a new home in a luxury Denver neighborhood. 3 years later, she gave birth to their daughter, and the family of 3 lived a seemingly simple, happy life, until 2012, when Tony tragically fell from a cliff and died. It was only after her death that Tony's parents realized how little they truly knew about Harold's business. In fact, they had never met any of his colleagues or clients. They vaguely recalled Tony mentioning that she was the family's primary breadwinner, as Harold contributed little financially. At the time, they assumed Harold's business was struggling, and they sent their daughter some checks to help out. But now, looking back, they wondered if Harold was truly the successful businessman he claimed to be. As police investigations revealed, Harold had no work history and had never earned a penny. All his expenses had been covered by the $600,000 settlement he received after his first wife's death. Furthermore, Tony's family reported that Harold had been extremely controlling, deliberately preventing Tony from contacting them. Whenever they called to speak with her, Harold made excuses, claiming Tony was busy, or insisted on putting the phone on speaker while he listened in. Tony occasionally argued with Harold, but he would threaten her, saying, "If you dare complain to your parents, I'll divorce you." Tony, unable to bear the thought of another failed marriage, endured Harold's behavior. Yet, his control over her seemed relentless. It's worth noting that Tony experienced a strange incident just before her fatal fall. On May 28, 2011, while on vacation, Harold suddenly called Tony to step outside the cabin. As she was about to exit, she noticed something had fallen onto the deck and bent down to inspect it. At that moment, a large piece of wood fell and struck her neck, causing her to collapse and become temporarily paralyzed. Fortunately, an ambulance arrived in time to take Tony to the hospital. Tony was terrified. She realized that if she hadn't bent down, the piece of wood would have hit her head. She recounted the incident to her mother, who was deeply worried and urged Tony to hire a private investigator to look into Harold. But Tony refused, insisting, "He's my husband. I must trust him unconditionally." Later, Tony's mother told the police that when she heard her daughter had fallen from a cliff, her suspicions immediately turned to Harold. She explained that Tony had been an excellent athlete in school, but a serious knee injury from a sports competition had led to 2 surgeries. If Harold truly loved Tony, he would have been aware of her physical limitations and taken better care of her. How could he not know that his wife had knee problems and couldn't walk long distances? At Tony's funeral, Harold changed his story, claiming that she had accidentally fallen while taking pictures of wild turkeys. Many observed that he appeared distressed and agitated after the service. However, friends of the couple noted that most of Harold's anxiety was due to the ongoing police investigation into Tony's death, and rightly so. Throughout October, police interviewed Tony's friends and family. One friend mentioned that Harold was controlling and resisted Tony socializing without him. When she went out, he followed her like an annoying shadow. Tony's only respite was when Harold occasionally left on supposed business trips to unknown destinations. The investigation also uncovered a startling detail. The life insurance policy Harold claimed was worth $1.5 million was actually much higher. Tony had multiple policies, all of which named Harold as the trustee, with a total value of nearly $4.7 million. But if Harold's motive was money, Tony was far more valuable alive. Her family's oil business was thriving, and her inheritance would be worth much more than a few $1,000,000. One friend recalled that about a year before the incident, during a gathering, Tony seemed exhausted and in low spirits. It was clear her marriage was unhappy. She confided in her friends that Harold was obsessed with controlling the family's finances. Their conversations revolved around money, leaving no room for anything else. Harold meticulously managed all of Tony's accounts, treating her as if she were invisible. His focus was solely on their finances and their daughter. At one point, Tony's father noticed something strange. Tony had some shares in the family business, generating annual dividends of around $24,000. 18 months before the accident, Tony had received $320,000 from a lawsuit related to a travel incident. However, her father discovered that all of that money had ended up in Harold's account. He angrily confronted Tony, asking why she didn't have her own account and why her finances weren't separate from her husband's. After this confrontation, Tony finally opened her own bank account. But Harold's need for control only intensified, pushing Tony to the brink of collapse. The next logical step could have been divorce, but Harold wasn't about to let go of his cash machine that easily. From Harold's perspective, Tony opening a bank account and saving money signaled her growing independence and possibly her intent to leave him. However, if Tony died, Harold would directly gain the $4.7 million from her life insurance policies. In summary, based on the current investigation results, it seems highly probable that Tony was murdered. And even worse, before Tony, Harold had another wife who had tragically died in a car accident. But did his first wife really die by accident? Let's rewind to the night of May 6, 1995, at 10:25 p.m. A passerby spotted a Jeep parked at an intersection on Highway 67 with a man crouching beside it, attempting to resuscitate a woman lying on the ground. That man was Harold. The woman on the ground was his first wife, Lynn. At Harold's request, the passerby called emergency services. The police soon confirmed that Lynn was dead. According to Harold, while driving, he noticed a flat tire. He used 3 jacks to lift the car and change the tire. While removing the flat tire and placing it in the car, he suddenly heard his wife scream. Lynn had spotted a bolt roll under the car and had bent down to retrieve it. The car then slipped off the jacks, trapping her underneath and causing fatal mechanical asphyxiation. Harold claimed he tried everything to free his wife and perform CPR, but it was too late. The police investigation found no anomalies at the scene, and the autopsy confirmed that Lynn's death was due to the car slipping and crushing her. The police classified it as an accidental death, with no suspicion linking Harold to Lynn's death. Their marriage had seemed happy, and even Lynn's parents believed Harold was an innocent, grieving widower. The report on Lynn's death remained filed away until 17 years later, when Tony, Harold's second wife, tragically fell to her death. When the police reopened Lynn's case, the parallels were too striking to ignore. 2 wives with substantial life insurance policies, both dying under unusual circumstances in remote areas, with Harold as the sole witness. The suspicions against him were overwhelming. According to internal sources, Harold had married his first wife, Lynn, in September 1982 in Colorado. At the time, Lynn worked as a daycare teacher while Harold pursued a master's degree and worked part-time as a consultant. Although the specifics of his job remain unclear, Lynn and Harold appeared to be the perfect couple to outsiders. Their only regret was not being able to have children. Lynn adored kids and often played with them at family gatherings. Shortly before the accident, Lynn had happily informed her family that she was pregnant and expected to have her own child soon. Tragically, that joy was short-lived. At Lynn's funeral, relatives from across the country gathered around Harold offering comfort and support. No one suspected Harold, given the genuine grief he displayed. Lynn's father even held Harold's hand as they sat together on a bench. Years later, Lynn's sisters remembered that she had always been a cautious person who would never crawl under a car propped up on jacks to retrieve a bolt. It simply wasn't in her nature. Roughly 4 years after Lynn's death, Harold began dating again. Lynn's family fully supported his efforts, hoping he would find love once more. They sincerely blessed Harold when he married Toni, encouraging him to go and find your happiness. In 2009, Grace, Lynn's sister-in-law, separated from her husband due to financial difficulties. Harold generously sent her hundreds of dollars by mail and encouraged her to move to Colorado with her children. Grace was deeply touched, embracing Harold as a brother. She confided her concerns about her daughter to him, and Harold introduced her to an insurance agent. Trusting Harold completely, Grace revealed all her personal information, including her social security number, salary, and savings. She signed the documents without reading them. In the following days, Harold continued to provide financial assistance, lending Grace $600 a month and sending her daughter to a Christian acting school. Though grateful, Grace began to feel uncomfortable when Harold sarcastically called her ungrateful if she refused his requests or suggestions. He attempted to control her life, but Grace soon found a job and canceled the policies she had signed. One day, 2 police officers knocked on her door to inform her that her policies had never been canceled. Harold had forged her signature and continued paying the premiums. Most shockingly, the $400,000 policy wasn't meant for Grace's children. It was intended for Harold. Horrified, Grace realized that Harold's continued invitations for her to stay close may have been part of a sinister plan with her as his next target. In 2013, police located a new witness in the car accident case. The witness had a remarkable memory and told police he clearly recalled Harold stating after the incident that he didn't know how to change a tire, which contradicted his previous statements to authorities. Investigators reenacted the scene where Lynn was crushed by the car. They realized that the bolt Lynn had allegedly been trying to retrieve was misshapen and couldn't have rolled far under the Jeep. In other words, someone must have deliberately thrown the bolt underneath. Additionally, when the police used a similar jack to lift the Jeep and tried throwing various tires into the back seat to see if the vehicle would fall off the jack, it didn't budge. The only way the Jeep could have fallen was if someone had approached the passenger side and pushed it hard. Coincidentally, photos from the scene showed a distinct footprint on the passenger side. At the same time, police confirmed that Harold had no verifiable income and had been living off the settlement from his first wife's death. Every claim about his business ventures and fundraising activities was a lie. Investigators also tracked Harold's phone and discovered that, in the summer and fall before Toni's fall, Harold had visited Rocky Mountain National Park 9 times, likely scouting for a location to murder Toni. On November 6, 2014, as usual, Harold dropped his daughter off at school before driving home. As the investigation deepened, Harold sensed the growing crisis. He constantly monitored his daughter, attempting to erase any memories she had of her mother. He trained her to be overly dependent on him, treating her as his possession and strictly controlling her interactions with the outside world. Naively, he believed this would gradually clear her mind of suspicion. But on the morning of October 6, 2014, when Harold returned from school drop-off, police arrested him. He was subsequently charged with first-degree murder in Tony's death. Harold refused to plead guilty. On November 12, 2014, Harold appeared in court, pleading not guilty. Meanwhile, police compiled their findings into an 11-page report detailing the flaws in the original investigation into Lynn's death. They pointed out that Harold had never been formally questioned with a recorded interview, and there had been no confrontation over the clear footprints on the car or the witness testimony. The report also noted that Lynn's autopsy didn't specify the car's direction or mention whether the tire had actually blown, as Harold claimed. Furthermore, investigators never thoroughly inspected Harold's car tires. Police questioned why, if Lynn had been under the car retrieving a bolt, her hands weren't dirty in the scene photos, nor was there any car grease on her body. Likewise, Harold's hands, despite having supposedly changed the tire, were spotless. What had really happened that day? Following this report, Lynn's death was reclassified from accidental to undetermined. Her family made their first public statement, urging authorities to carry out a thorough investigation into her death. On January 29, 2015, authorities announced a new round of investigations into Lynn's death. However, given the case's age, finding enough evidence to prosecute Harold remained a daunting task. On May 11, 2015, 20 years after Lynn's death was ruled accidental, a hearing was held. The prosecution presented the life insurance policies of Grace, the incident with the falling beam, the cliff fall, and the gaps in the original investigation to demonstrate Harold's involvement in Lynn's death. However, the defense argued that there were no signs of a struggle at the scene and that emergency services had never considered her injuries to be the result of deliberate action. Moreover, her insurance policies were confirmed by her own signatures, and there was no evidence Harold had tampered with them. A few days later, the first review of Lynn's death concluded, with some evidence lost forever in faulty memories. Police slowly realized that seeking justice for Lynn wouldn't be easy. On September 2, 2015, Harold's trial for Tony's murder officially began. There was little suspense as police presented photos from the crime scene and Tony's body. They recounted Harold's lies about his work and other matters, including his claim to have tried to save his wife, even though the evidence showed her lipstick remained perfectly intact. The prosecution highlighted that Harold had provided multiple versions of how Tony fell from the cliff, sometimes saying he was standing behind her, other times claiming he was fiddling with a camera or phone. However, the evidence proved these stories false. The camera was nearly untouched, and Harold had intentionally shown photos to paint a picture of a loving relationship with Tony. Additionally, at the time of Tony's fall, Harold couldn't have seen the babysitter's text about their daughter's soccer win, as the message arrived at 5:54 p.m. Yet, just 1 minute later, Harold was beside Tony's body, making an emergency call. Police reminded the jury that Harold hadn't immediately called authorities from the top of the cliff. Instead, after witnessing Tony's fall, he had calmly gathered his belongings, descended slowly, and only after moving Tony's body from the pile of rocks did he casually make the call. When police instructed Harold to perform CPR, Tony had likely been dead for over an hour. Photos of the scene revealed bloodstains on the rocks, indicating severe head trauma from the fall, as Harold had dragged Tony by her legs, causing her head to slam against the rocks. Additionally, during his call to police, Harold mentioned that Tony might have a concussion, showing more concern for when he could be rescued than for his wife's health. Harold invented numerous stories about Tony's death without displaying any remorse, as he had been planning her murder for some time. Immediately after the funeral, Harold swiftly took possession of Tony's phone, wiped her computer, and filed insurance claims. His cold-blooded nature and greed were eerily similar to what had happened with his first wife, Lynn, especially the conspicuous markings on the cliff map, which proved the murder was premeditated. Around 3 p.m. on September 21, 2015, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict for Harold, finding him guilty of first-degree murder. On December 8, 2015, Harold was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He later appealed, but it was denied. Harold remains incarcerated, and it is likely he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. It's important to note that, over the years, authorities have continued to seek evidence to prosecute Harold for Lynn's murder, though the lack of evidence has made this difficult. In memory of Tony, her parents established a donation fund at the University of Mississippi Medical Center to train future generations of ophthalmologists. Tony and Harold's only daughter was entrusted to Tony's family for her upbringing. She increasingly resembles her mother and has expressed interest in pursuing a career in medicine, perhaps following in Tony's footsteps to become a healthcare hero. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.